We now have the possibility for questions, and there's a mic that can move around the room. The default is that I ask the panel questions, and I think you'd rather ask them yourself. So, sir.
Thank you very much for the three presentations.
Everyone could please identify themselves.
Oh, I'm sorry. This is Garth Trinkle, U.S. Department of Commerce. This is a question for all four of you, including Dr. Leipziger. I believe that at least three of the four of you are on this, the Growth Dialogue successor to the Commission on Growth and Development. And my question is Sir Dwight Viner mentioned the Human Development Index, but I wanted to know whether there was a conscious attempt now to focus the new dialogue that the Spence and Solo Commission on growth and why you're not calling this a growth and development dialogue. And we're at a time now of coming out of a crisis and changing the way of thinking about economics as a whole, which has taken such a large body blow in the last 2 years. And you have people, you have the criticism of gross domestic product, and you have the development of the Human Development Index, and you have the Stiglitz, Sen, Fortuzzi Commission, and I don't understand why you're referring to this just as a growth commission rather than a growth and development. Sorry for the long-windedness.
It's fine. We'll take 3 or 4 questions and then divide them up as best we can. Were there other questions from the floor? Stephen.
Yeah, if no one else has a question, I heard a variety of causes. Of the crisis mentioned. One that some of our speakers this year have stressed represent the global imbalances and the impact that they had on financial flows and some of the other issues that were mentioned, such as perhaps lax Fed policy and the like. I wonder if our panelists might address the extent to which the deep global imbalances may be an underlying cause of the crisis and some of the perhaps proximate causes that were named, and even a concern going forward for additional crisis problems.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes.
Yes, my name is Alnawaz Dipani, and I'm a freshman at GW. I'm majoring in international affairs. One of the questions that I also had was that with growth and development, can you also address the Doha development agenda and how to revive that and how that can actually affect the development for emerging markets, particularly with the issue of liberalizing agriculture?
Okay, thank you. Other questions? Well, let me then just add to the pile, and we'll let the panel answer, except for the question that you posed about the Growth Commission, Growth Dialogue, which I'll deal with at the end. I was hoping that we could ask Governor DiGregorio to come back on this issue of capital controls, and I know where you are on it, since you've done some econometric work on it, as I recall, showing that it didn't have much of an impact. Nonetheless, with Brazil having put some control on capital, and as you say, with the undesired effects of monetary tightening, increasing capital inflows and appreciating the currency, what scope do you see for differentiating between different types of capital flows to protect sort of more vulnerable economies? And for Minister Mohildeen, a fellow countryman of yours, Mohamed El Arian, has spoken about the new normal, and part of the new normal involves a world of higher interest rates, higher debt, less open trade, et cetera, et cetera. If you give any credence to that, does that affect the development strategy that you would like to see Egypt pursue? And then for Sir Dwight, you did mention Greece, so I was going to ask you the implications of the Greek experience for a currency union such as yours. But I'd like to add to that, and remember in the Growth Commission, we only half-jokingly said vis-a-vis the growth rate of Chile, which at the time there was a discussion about potential growth rates, and was it 3.9 or 4.1? And we joked that we would move the cabinet from Singapore into Chile and see whether or not that binding constraint on growth was still true. So I wanted to ask you the same thing, Sir Dwight. What if we brought the Singaporeans who manage with small economies? We brought them to the Caribbean. Would they be able to deal more successfily with some of the challenges that you've raised?
Maybe no more graffiti.
So with that, can I leave those? We'll go down the row here. And remember the two other questions that were posed to you as panelists had to do with the imbalance question, and then Doha, if you feel that you'd like to answer either of those, and I'll come back on yours at the very end.
Well, there was a comment also, a question for people in the Growth Commission, growth versus growth and development.
Yes, please.
But I will make you my point anyway, although I'm not a member of the Commission. I think that we have to focus. I fully agree, Human Development Index and all that we know, and that growth is not enough for development, but growth is a necessary condition for development. So what happens that many times we start talking about growth and development and other goals and happiness, and we end up just with a lot of things, but nothing concrete. So I think that in a way there is no example of countries that has developed without strong growth, high levels of income. And I'm extremely worried about inequality and environment, but that's, we can deal with that too. But that's what I think that in terms of policy agenda in general, I like to focus a lot on growth, because that's what we like. Regarding the global imbalances, there is a discussion, but I think that the global imbalances were an important ingredient because they provide the liquidity and the funding for the rapid growth of financial activities in the U.S. But what, in my view, is at the core of the crisis were the weaknesses of the financial system in the U.S., and that we have learned a lot about a lot of things that we could have done and avoided the crisis. That sometimes there is a boom, that asset prices go up, but the collapse in the financial system and the almost meltdown of financial assets was the key, I think, cause of the crisis. But without global imbalances, of course, there wouldn't. And the global imbalances, what was? A lot of liquidity around the world. And a lot of liquidity around the world in a very competitive world with low interest rate, and a lot of incentives for search for yield. And that search for yield was a key for all the financial innovation and what then created the financial collapse. And regarding Danny's question, I don't care that much about capital controls. It's not that I do not have a religion. I think that they won't help Brazil. They are not helping. They are appreciating anyway. Mm-hmm. So they help. Sometimes what they say is that from the politics, people want policymakers to be concerned. So many times policymakers do things that do not do harm. They are not very useful, but they do them, and they look, and so they can help to create a speech and a vision, you know, that is coherent with what you want. But I'm not a fan, but I don't say that they will create huge problems and all of that. What I think that's important, and the point that you raise is exactly the right one, is that how to differentiate according to the type of flows in order to reduce the vulnerabilities. So I think that that's the issue. The issue is I don't mind that much about equity flows, stock prices adjust, and that's a private deal. The problem is with the banking system. So the differentiation, rather than doing it through a form of capital controls, you should have to do it through banking regulation and provisioning and many other things that you could do, even taxation if you want. But that's where I think that you have to try to avoid vulnerabilities. But I think that the best way, having a strong financial system, but the best way to avoid vulnerabilities is to have a policy framework with flexible exchange rate. I think that the attempt to avoid appreciation many times is what creates the pressure for the appreciation. This is a story of many countries with high interest rate trying to fight an appreciation, but the market knows that sooner or later they will appreciate and they keep coming. So I think that there is a lot of, and what we have to avoid is that capital controls are reformed to avoid doing the right things. And they could be complement, but not substitute.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to Minister Mohaldin, who I know has another appointment, so we're glad that you could at least stay this long.
Well, thank you so much, and I'll be very brief. On the issue of, again, the issue of growth and development, I think in the report has been dealing with this issue in a sort of a two-way street, that growth requires some prerequisites and some conditions that should be there as a critical minimum of development, and then the returns of growth are going to be feeding development to sustain that over time. There is no issue here of being of conflict or necessary trade-offs between the two goals as such. And one of the things that we need to be looking at in the future, and I'm glad that the Institute here is considering the issue of poverty and ultra-poverty. I think the issue of inequality as well is very much a big issue of concern, given that sectors do not respond to reform measures adequately and simultaneously. And different provinces and governorates would really react differently as well. And if you consider a gender aspect to that, you will find a great deal of discrepancy responsible for a great deal of unhappiness and a great deal of frustration as far as the human indicators of development are concerned. The issue of the new normal, yes, it's a constraint. And while we have been very happy during the last 4 years that we, before the crisis, we managed to have growth doubled from 3.5 to 7%, to have FDI going from less than 1% of GDP to around 8% of GDP, to have the private sector contribution almost doubled within 5 years. This had been all available in a very benign environment for emerging markets. We cannot really do all of these things while you have these kinds of problems and constraints and capital inflows and protectionism and the rest of the list that was reflected in the good article by Muhammad Al-Irian. But related to that is the issue of the Doha round and agriculture. And again, you cannot really, and this could be one of the useful things that we learn, that developing countries are not the same. The third world is not one unique homogeneous group. And there are countries that could, like Egypt and some North African countries, would be very much beneficiaries of development in opening up of the agricultural file, and they are very competitive and they enjoy comparative advantage. Others may not really have that. They could have the potential, but they have been having that potential for hundreds of years and never exploited that, because agriculture is not just about putting some seeds and adding water. It's very sophisticated business today, infrastructure, logistics, the environmental consideration, the packaging and the marketing. So this is really in need, again, to be more careful with the impact when opening these files. There are no developing countries group as such. There is no third world unit as such. So it's a case-by-case basis, more or less, on that. I'd like to thank you all for giving me this opportunity, and I have to run to catch the other meeting. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. On the growth versus development issue, in a very practical sense, we've seen the impact of a lack of growth. If you don't have growth, you can't absorb the unemployed, you can't reduce the poverty levels, and you can't maintain or improve the HDIs. It sort of goes in a sort of sequence. I mean, you have to build the infrastructure, which requires human capital development. But the issue is there is you require the resources for that, the revenue resources. So I think in the growth report, we came down and decided that you need to hit a rate of growth which you could sustain over time. The experience shows that over time, those countries which experience that rate of growth, the level of inequality actually was not as big in some countries as proceeded before. So that you really have to manage the growth so it becomes inclusive. And that is why I refer to the title of the report. It says, sustained growth and inclusive development. So you're not ignoring those other things. In fact, throughout the report, there's a lot of stuff on health, on education, on leadership management, all those other issues which contribute to growth. But unless you have a growth momentum, there's no way, shape, or form that you're going to address those other things. So that it may be a little misguided to try and split things before. In terms of the imbalances, I mean, obviously, I remember Greenspan saying once that if an imbalance is unsustainable, it will change. The thing is the nature of the change, whether it's orderly or disorderly. Increasingly since the Asian crisis, what we've seen is a number of steps to improve the regulatory framework to ensure that, in my words, that international financial stability is a public good. Because if it's not functioning, as we've seen with dramatic effect in this case, the impact on the rest of the world is so significant that the recovery and the costs are extremely, extremely high. Greece. Greece is a very interesting example, a little different from ours in the sense that in the European Union, which is part of the developed world, the whole issue of a member going into the International Monetary Fund seems to signal some difficulty or failure of a part of the arrangement. And the last G7 country to go to the IMF, I think, was the UK, way back in the 1970s. And that caused a lot of angst in that country. In our case, we've worked out our arrangements with the International Monetary Fund and among ourselves. We have a fiscal tranche which we use for defending the currency among ourselves. But of course, that is not sufficient. And therefore, we've had to make arrangements with the International Monetary Fund, whose job it is to back up countries who have balance of payments problems. The International Monetary Fund in recent times, in addition to the regular surveillance, which is bilateral with the countries, is called Article 4s, now have what they call currency union reviews, where they quite rightly think that the systemic stability depends not only on individual countries which are systemically important, but of course as well regional entities which are, as a region, very, very important. As for the transfer of the, of the Singaporean cabinet, interestingly enough, Singapore is the same size as one of our countries, my country, St. Lucia. I don't think the regime in Singapore would be quite acceptable in our part of the world. But suffice it to say, I think what we need to do is change our development model. At the present time, we operate in what I term an input consumption default model, which is not functioning anymore. And we need to go to a new model, and that is what the transition is about. But these countries before the 1980s had episodically hit a 7% rate of growth. It has not been sustainable. So the economic union, which is an aggregation really of countries and populations and freedom of movement of resources, could give us that. Plugged into the US economy as we are, the issue is growth in the United States economy and to a lesser extent Canada. So I think that and good coordinated policies could get us there.
Well, thank you very much. I think my fellow panelists have more or less answered the question, and I wouldn't read too much into the title of Growth Dialogue versus Growth Commission on Growth and Development. So with that, we come to the end of this panel discussion. I want to thank our speakers and all of you for coming, and this will be available on the web, and there'll be many more people watching it probably in China, and hopefully not hacking into the GW website. So thank you all very much.